the recording, and we should be good to go.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mike. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right, awesome. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited to share with you all this HR Diversity Scorecard that I've created at Lovelytics and how it's going to help organizations really understand their numbers. I am Chantilly Jaggernauth. I'm the Vice President of Data Visualization and Training for Lovelytics, and I am also a 2019 and 2020 Tableau Zen Master. So for today's agenda, there are a couple of points that I want to make sure that we hit on. The first of them being, why is diversity important, and why is it important for your organization to really understand and know your numbers? Second, we're going to dive into some of the metrics that we are displaying in the scorecard. We're going to talk about the details of the scorecard. We'll go into details around how to share and communicate these results, because essentially diversity information is very confidential. So I want to make sure that you all are equipped with how to share this information internally within your organizations. And then we're going to talk about beyond the dashboard. So what are some things to consider when you are looking for action items beyond just this dashboard? So let's dive right into it. So the first thing that I want to touch on is really knowledge versus understanding. The title of this webinar is Understanding Your Numbers. It's not knowing your numbers, it's understanding your numbers. And I think that there's a clear difference between knowing and understanding, and how that reflects in knowing and understanding your diversity numbers. So let's talk about some basic definitions. Knowledge is the state of being aware or informed. So you know what your numbers are. You're informed of what your numbers are. You have 50% women in your organization. You have 50% of people of color in your organization. That's the knowing part of it. That's the very high level part of it. And knowledge is what's needed in order to have somewhat of an understanding. And understanding is a tool that helps people assimilate new information and continually refine their worldview by seeing connections. So understanding is really diving deeper into what you already know, right? So why do we just have 50% people of color within our organization? Are there areas for improvement? So understanding is taking it a step further rather than just knowing and having insight into something. And I saw a really great quote online that I wanted to share with you all. Knowing and understanding are related concepts, but they're not the same. Each is a distinct mental state involving cognitive grasp. Knowing is static, right? Your number is static. It's referring to discrete facts, how many employees in your organization are diverse. While understanding is active, describing the ability to analyze and place those facts in context to form a bigger picture. And the bigger picture that we're going to talk about today is diversity within your organization. So without knowledge, understanding is impossible. But I always say without understanding, meaningful change cannot occur. So keep that in mind as you think about your numbers. So why is diversity important? Here are a couple of points that I was able to pull from Talent Lift, an organization that helps organizations in terms of talent and understanding why diversity is important when it comes to finding and hiring the right talent. For one, a diverse workforce brings a variety of different perspectives. You'll see increased creativity because individuals have different backgrounds, they have different perspectives on things. So they're gonna bring that to the workforce, or they're gonna bring that to your organization when they come, right? It increases innovation, so more innovation. It increases profits. I've seen some findings that were done by PwC that state that organizations that have 35% more people of color, or organizations that have a higher percentage of people of color, have 35% more profits within that compared to other organizations within that industry. So keep some of those numbers in mind. So not only is diversity good for the employees within, but it's also good for your business. You'll see reduced employee turnover with diversity. So if I come into an organization and I see leadership team that I can relate to as a Black woman, I see colleagues that I can relate to as a Black woman, and I'm just within a diverse workforce in general, that's going to assist in me, wanting to stay with the organization for a longer period of time. You'll see higher employee engagement, better decision making, you'll improve your hiring results, your company will have a better reputation overall, and then you can even see faster problem solving. So there are a ton of benefits as to why diversity is really important. And given today's events and what's going on in the world today, I think it's very important for organizations to really dive into each of their numbers and start to really understand diversity and how it is throughout their workforce. So what gets measured gets done. So there are a ton of ways that organizations can start to measure diversity and track diversity. So let's dive a little bit into the data and let's talk about some metrics that can be used to identify bias and areas for improvement. So these are the areas of focus that the dashboard or the scorecard that we're going to talk about today focused on. Representation is really one of the main metrics that I see a lot of organizations report on. It's a very high number that just reports the number of employees within a certain group compared to the entire organization. So what's the percentage of women within our organization? What's the percentage of people of color? It's a very high number. It's a high level number. So the pro for that is that it can quickly identify underrepresentation within the organization. A con is that this data at a high level obscures data related to functions, roles, and departments. So when you look at, at a high level, 50% women within your organization, are they all lower analysts? Or do we see, more men within higher roles within the organization? So these high representation numbers do not provide all the details. Right? So the next metric that we want to talk about is retention. So retention is the average tenure for employees within a certain group compared to the entire organization. So for people of color, how long do they typically stay with the organization? How long have they been with the organization? At a high level, so the pro is that you can quickly identify groups that may be less satisfied with their workplace and less committed to the organization. But a con is that this does not provide you information regarding the reasons why some people are leaving before others, right? In terms of satisfaction looks at how satisfied an employee is with their role. So a percentage for a group, how satisfied are they with their role compared to the others within the rest of the organization. Now, good here is that it's good for identifying whether certain groups of employees are experiencing lower levels of satisfaction. But then a con is that a lot of these satisfaction and engagement surveys are optional, right? So an employee may opt to not take this survey or take this engagement survey if they don't feel as though they're engaged with the organization or if they're satisfied with the organization. This can skew your results, right? And a lot of existing surveys do not record diversity dimensions associated with them, because when you're sending out these surveys within your organizations, employees are not required to identify who they are. You try to typically anonymize these surveys, and when you want to look at satisfaction across and diversity in their intersection, it's a little bit hard because those dimensions are excluded. And then in terms of performance tracks scores, performance scores specifically for certain groups of employees compared to the rest of the organization. Now, a pro for tracking performance and diversity is that it's useful for identifying bias and assessment, right? But a con is that it really doesn't provide information regarding why certain groups underperform or outperform others. It also does not track development opportunities. So did one group that is highly diverse or not highly diverse have more chances or more budget for more development, right, compared to another group? So I say all this to say that a con in this instance isn't necessarily a bad thing if you dive into the data a bit more and look for more understanding and more clarity. However, a con is magnified here if you're just looking at these numbers at a very high level. So these are the metrics that we're going to dive into today, specifically for the HR scorecard that we've developed. But there are other metrics that you can look at within your organization, right? So I'm looking at 5 main areas. Here are another 4 that you can start to look at as well. So you can look at diversity in your recruitment and selection process. You can look at diversity and advancement, so promotions, inline promotions. You can look at diversity for development opportunities and who's being trained and who's not, right? You can look at budgeting for that as well. Then you can also look at diversity in terms of compensation. So the reason that I'm showing you all of these metrics is because a lot of organizations think that representation, just providing your representation numbers is enough. No, there's a lot of context and a lot of ways that you can really dive into these metrics. You can dive into them and look at them at a high level, but then you're going to be faced with a lot of the cons, or you can, dive a little bit deeper and start to remediate some of these cons, right? Start to understand which groups are underdeveloped. You can start to understand which groups aren't satisfied. Why are people actually leaving the organization, instead of just looking at those numbers as a whole? So don't just stay within the representation bucket and say, oh, we have 60% diversity, we're good. Make sure that you're understanding other metrics that are related to that. So the data that I used to create the scorecard that we're going to dive into is what you see here on the screen, right? So working in HR previously before joining Lovelytics, I personally know that all of this data is not available within one system. If your organization is there, then kudos to you, but typically a lot of this information is located within various systems. So you have your HR information that might be in your SAP platform, and your employee performance information may be hosted with another vendor that does the performance reviews. So this is the clean version of the data set, right? Where we have employee ID, employee name, date of hire, gender, and sex, which typically come from a roster file, including maybe even position ID in the position that the employees are currently in. But then you also have performance scores, which may come from another file. You have race, which comes from your roster file typically, and then you have employee satisfaction as well. So this is the clean version of it. I didn't show you all how to manipulate that data because it varies depending on your organization, but essentially all you need here is a list of your active employees, so your current employees, and that's typically a roster file. You need your gender and your sex and your ethnicity dimensions for those employees. And then when you look at your performance data, you typically want a final performance score or average performance score for whatever the latest period is. So you want the employee ID from there, you want their performance scores, and then for employee satisfaction, you want a final score as well. So you want typically one score that's related to each employee ID. Now, as I mentioned before, employee satisfaction might be a little hard to track. So I will say that this data was created with the assumption that you have that information readily available. And I'll also note here that all of this data is fake, right? This is fake data. This is not real data. I made this data using Macaru, which is where you can a site where you can make fake data. So this is not, our Lovelytics data set, but I'm showing you this because if you're able to create a file that is very similar to the one that you see on my screen, then you can easily replicate the dashboard that I'm going to show you simply by editing the data source and connecting to your own worksheet, as long as it looks very similar to this one. All right, so now let's talk about how we brought it all together in Tableau. So here is the final diversity scorecard that I created. Before we dive under the hood for all of the bits and pieces of it, I'm going to walk through the dashboard at a very high level so you have an understanding of some of the metrics that we're portraying here. So the first thing you see is a count of how many employees we are producing information for. So for this organization, you can think of this as like an active roster report. We're displaying information related to 2,422 employees. Now, remember when I said you can have certain metrics, there are certain areas that you can identify. The first one was representation. That is what you see here. So your overview section is your overall representation. So across the entire organization, we see that there's 60.5% diversity. So when we think of diversity, that's typically either a female or a person of color. So anyone preferably unknown or a white male is going to be considered non-diverse. And you hover over this, you have the actual number of employees. Gender, so you have your women versus non women, so your women versus your males or your NAs. And then your people of color, which I identify as POC, you have that number as well. And then if you work in a tech organization or an organization where the number of Asians within your organization might skew your person of color, there is a flag here that allows you to either include or exclude them. Every organization is different. I know from prior experience, we reported on both of these where we included Asians within the person of color count, but if you exclude them, then typically what you're seeing there is your African Americans or your Blacks. You're also seeing your Hispanics and your Latinos within that section, and then your multiracial individuals. So POC NA is going to exclude Asians from that person of color count. So I'm going to keep them right now for this demo purpose. Next, we have representation again, but we're now breaking it out by job level. So remember when I was saying that, representation is good, but one of the cons for it is that you don't really start to understand these numbers in terms of positions and job levels and things like that. So here we're taking it a step further and we're breaking out representation by job level. So you can see vice presidents overall in the organization, 62% of them are diverse. Now, if you keep looking over to the right for vice president, 47% of them are female. However, only 18% are people of color. So this is letting me know that our diversity numbers are high, more so because of the female population within our workforce and not necessarily the people of color within our workforce. So that's something that immediately sticks out here. And the same thing for the director role, right? We have 48% diversity for our director positions, 46% of them for females are females. However, only 4% are people of color. So that's another thing that really sticks out, right? But you would not see that at this high level. You would not see that at this high level of representation. So here's where, we're taking that knowledge and we're breaking it down a little bit further to get to understanding, right? So then we keep scrolling down. We have satisfaction. So at a high level, we're looking at the satisfaction scores. And what you see here is that it's pretty even, right? So everyone is for average satisfaction scores across the board in terms of diverse versus non-diverse, female versus male / NA, people of color versus non-people of color. And now when you take those satisfaction scores and you break them down from 1 being the lowest satisfaction score to 5 being the highest, you can start to see some differences there, just very minor differences. But you see most of the organization is within the 3, 4, and the 5 range, whether it's diversity, percentage female, percentage people of color. Next, we have tenure information, right? So tenure was one of the buckets, so one of the metrics that I referred to earlier. And tenure is looking at how long has an employee been with the organization. So we're breaking it out. How long have our diverse employees been with the organization? 3.2 years. Then you have your non-diverse population as well. You have your percentage female, you have your males, and you can start to see exactly how long they've been with the organization. That's rather close. And the same thing for people of color. And now you have tenure buckets, right? So a tenure bucket is essentially grouping everyone's tenure into smaller buckets instead of looking at it at a higher level. So how many of our employees have been here less than a year? How many of them have been here 1 to 2 years, 2 to 3 years, 3 to 5 years, 5+ years? And you can start to see that breakout by diverse, non-diverse, female, and males. You can see people of color and non-people of color. And then last but not least, performance is another area that we decided to focus on for this scorecard, where at a high level, you can see those performance numbers. And then at a lower level, you can start to see the exact scores. And you hover over this, you see the score description. So 1 is the lowest score, 4 is the highest score. And nothing sticks out though until I get to the people of color, and I see that the majority for this particular group receives a 2 rating, right? Compared to other groups where the majority is kind of evenly distributed for the most part. Like you have some 2s, you have more 3s and more 4s, but that's something that kind of sticks out here. But when something sticks out, that's just a sense for you, or it should be a click for you or a sign for you to dive a little bit deeper into those numbers. Maybe you know, like this group wasn't offered as many development opportunities as other groups. Maybe it's a particular business unit within your organization, right? So this is what I consider a starter workbook, and something that organizations can use to start to understand their numbers at a high level. But this isn't enough. You really have to dive deeper into each of these areas to really start to grasp what is going on and what biases there may be and what needs to be addressed, right? So let's dive into this, and I'll show you all how each of these worksheets were created in case you were wondering some of the technical details behind it. So number of employees is simply a total count of employees, right? So total employees is a count distinct of employee ID, right? Next, when we think of diversity, or when we're trying to measure diversity here, we want to count a person once, whether they were a female or a person of color. So if someone in the organization was a Black woman, we don't want to count them twice. We only want to count them once for a diversity flag. So in order to do that, I created first sets within Tableau. So to create a set, you simply right-click on any of the fields that you want to create a set for, and then you say create and then set, and you can say who's in that set and who's not. So I created a set that said diverse. So I selected diverse, and I said if you're in this set, then you're considered diverse. Actually created two sets first, so a female set and a POC set, and I said if you are within the POC set or within the female set, then you're considered diverse, else you are considered non-diverse, right? So to create a set, as I mentioned before, you simply right-click on the field and you say create set. And here, if you wanted to say any employee who is a female, you could call this the female set. Any employee who falls within this is considered a female. Anyone that falls within the other set is considered a person of color. If they fall in either of those, then they are considered diverse. So that was one of the first things that I did in order to determine who's diverse and who's not diverse. So then in terms of gender, this one was pretty simple because as I mentioned, there's a set here. So it was easy to identify who was in this set and who was not in this set. So we have females, and then we have nulls and males. And then for people of color and people of color NA, in order to transition or switch between the two, I had to create a parameter. And the parameter, first thing you do is you actually create the parameter itself. So this is step one, creating the parameter. It says include Asians, exclude Asians, and the POC count. So that's step one, you create a parameter. Now, a parameter is simply useless unless you activate it. So I always say you have to activate a parameter by either creating a calculated field and using it on filters or within your view. So in this instance, I created a calculated field that activated this parameter. I actually created many calculated fields to activate this parameter, but I said that if they fell within, if the parameter was equal to include Asian in the POC count, then I am calling on the non-POC set. So I have a non-POC set that is referring to the count of employees there. And then the same thing for people of color NA. So where to exclude Asians, I'm calling that out as well. So this is me activating the parameter. And then from there, you're simply just using those calculated fields within your view. So here, I'm using that calculated field within the view. And that's how I'm able to switch and toggle between representation for people of color, and then same for representation of people of color non-Asian. Next, in terms of diversity per job level, within your data set, if you're able to pull in position or job level, that's what's going to get you diversity per job level. These bars are out of 100%. I'm actually going to increase the height of them so you can see them. These bars are out of 100%. So the entirety of the bar is 100%, which is simply a float one. So it's a simple 1, that just gives me all of this, because remember this is a percentage, so this is actually 0.62. So this light bar is 1, and then the percent diverse was a calculated field that said if you were, if you fell into the diverse set, then you're going to get counted. So diverse count divided by total employees, which is the count distinct of all of the employees, and that's what's going to give me the percentage of diversity broken out for each of the levels. Now I simply just did a dual axis chart to get these two bars on top of each other. So I can show you here, if I deselect dual axis, you'll see that this is simply one chart that goes from 0 to 1, and this is another chart that goes from 0 to whatever percent diversity is. And when you place them on top of each other by doing a dual axis chart, here you have it. But what you'll see here is that these numbers are a little skewed, right? This says 62%, but the bar is all the way over here, and that's because we did not synchronize the axis. So make sure that if you are doing something similar, that you synchronize that axis, and that's how you get this chart right here. And that was the same steps that I took for percent female, the exact same steps. So once you have one chart, you don't have to recreate it from scratch. You can simply just duplicate this chart right here by right-clicking on it and saying duplicate. And instead of starting, your percent of female from scratch, you can just substitute out these numbers, change the colors, and that's how you're able to achieve that chart without having to start from scratch. So here is a percent female per job level. And then for people of color, NA, because I've already created these calculated fields that count whether or not a person is considered a person of color or a person of color non-Asian, I'm able to use that calculated fields here and divide whatever number is going to return here, divide that in order to get people of color versus people of color NA. And I'm simply using that field right here. So it's still using that parameter. We're just using, two fields, or we're referencing two different fields within this parameter to adjust the length of these bars. Now for satisfaction, right? So typically, I do not recommend aggregate and satisfaction scores. And this gets into measures of central tendency and statistics and whatnot, and whether you should be using average or whether you should be using median. It all depends on what's going to give you the true typical number depending on your data set, and that varies. So in this instance, I've used average, but there may be instances where you'll see me use the median score instead of the average score, especially if your numbers are skewed, and that's a whole different lesson and data literacy topic that I can get into for another day. But here I'm simply using the average employee satisfaction score broken out by the diverse dimension. So if I go back to the diverse dimension, it simply states that if a person falls into either one of these sets that I've created, then they're considered diverse versus non-diverse. And that was the exact same thing that I went ahead and did for gender. And the same thing for people of color NA. Now to break it out by the actual score itself, these are actually 3 charts that are next to each other. So the first chart that you see here is the diversity count. So each bar represents a diverse person, and this is simply a percent of total. So I'm seeing for the diverse employees, out of all the diverse employees, what's the percent of total of the employees that scored a 3, that rated their satisfaction as a 3? So these percentages are within a particular group. Now you can change it to represent it whichever fits your business need. You can do this reading across, you can do this reading down. In this instance, I'm reading down for my percent of total. So all of these bars here are gonna add up to 100%. And the same thing for these. So you can see within each of the groups, what are they rating? So for diverse employees, satisfaction score, the highest one was a 3. So that's the typical satisfaction scores. The percent of total was 3 versus non-diverse employees. The percent of total for highest scores was a 5. So the majority of non-diverse employees rated their satisfaction as a 5. And that was the same thing that I did for the females versus males. We can see the highest here. It's actually 3, 4, and 5 versus here it's once again 5. And the same thing here. And if you would like to take this a step further, remember I say your numbers at a high level, they just provide, knowledge. They don't really provide understanding. If you wanted to take this a bit further, you could start to break this out by particular roles, right? If you wanted to put position on here and you see within each of the positions, which one rates the highest and which one rates the lowest, you can see that as well. You can change how you're computing your quick table calculation. So right now it's computing the entire table down, but if you wanted to compute just within the VP group and see what was highest, what was lowest, you can do that as well, simply by right-clicking and changing your quick table calculation. So that is that chart and how you can dive a little bit deeper into it. And then you have your tenure, right? So I'll actually dive into the tenure buckets and how I created them. So for your tenure buckets, I first created a calculated field that identified the years that an employee was with the company. So to do that, where is it at? Years with company. I'm simply taking a date difference in terms of years between the date of hire, which is something that you typically get from an employee roster file, and today's date. So I can see exactly how many years, even to the decimal point, has an employee been with the company. Then from there, I'm creating these tenure buckets. And I'm saying, if the tenure bucket was less than a year, then it's 1 year. If the years with the company was less than or equal to 2, then that's 1 and 2 years. Same thing for 3, 5, and then everything else is going to fall into 5+ years. So this is assuming that we have a data point for every single person. If not, then just be careful because your nulls will fall into this bucket as well. So you make sure you're doing some data validation on your end before you just do an else 5+ years. Because if you have any person who does not have, any data associated with them, then with this else 5+ years, everyone else is going to fall into that bucket. So be very careful when you're doing this type of calculation and using an else. So I went ahead and did that. And then here, I'm actually not looking at percents of totals. I'm looking at raw counts of employees broken out by diverse or not diverse. And the same thing for your females, and the same thing for your people of color. If percentages mean more to your organization, then that's simply something that you can edit and go ahead and do as well. But this is just looking at raw counts of employees, so the number of employees that fall within these groups. And then last but not least, the performance ratings. So to get the performance ratings, first you needed the performance score. So every line here, if I show the header, represents a particular performance score. So you have 1 being the lowest performance score, and then 4 being the highest, meaning that they exceed. Now to get these 2 columns, I simply just created what I call a fake axis, which is a min 0. And on each of those, I changed the data point to a circle. You can have it as a bar. It'll give you a very similar result. But I changed the data, the mark type to a circle. And the size of the circle corresponds to the percent of total as well for that particular group. So here, these percentages will add up to 100%. And the same thing here. So within a particular group, so this is diverse versus non-diverse, what is the percent of total in comparison to the performance rating? So we see for diverse, that's a 2, and then pretty much the same thing for non-diverse, but it's spread out a little bit more between 2, 3, and 4. And then that's the same information that pretty much portrayed on the female one and the people of color one. Additional things that you can do with this data, if you have it available, you can have filters within it, right? So I do not have filters here. This is looking at the entire organization, but I know that a lot of companies do not look at the entire organization. You're looking at particular business units, right? So if this is something that you wanted to create and share within your organization, you might want to have this high level view, but then allow leaders of various business units and departments the ability to come in and filter directly to their particular business unit, right? So those are some things that we did not incorporate, but if you have the data available, be sure to add it in and just add it as a filter to this dashboard. So that's the dashboard itself at a really high level. And there's a lot of information or a lot of things that you can do, beyond this dashboard, simply by diving in a little bit deeper into some of those data points that we have. This is just aggregating all of this information at a high level. And I think this is a good starting point. That's why we call it a starter workbook. But will be 10 times more powerful if you take this information and you dive into it a whole lot deeper. So with that, I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint deck. So we are talking about employee information. So this is personal identification information, right? So this is very sensitive data. So if you are an HR analyst or someone within your organization who is handling confidential information that you see here, then it's important that you also understand how to share and communicate these results so that you're not compromising anyone's identity, especially when we're talking about in terms of satisfaction scores and performance scores. Like, that's very sensitive information. And I know that as an employee within an organization, I would not want that type of information shared with just anyone in the org, right? So I want to talk about sharing and communicating this information if you have Tableau Server or Tableau Online within your organization. So once you have this dashboard built and you're ready to share it, right, there are several things that you can do. You can build in user level filters within this. As long as the user is within your Tableau server environment, you can set up information that says, or you can set up parameters or filters that say, as long as they fall within this group, then they have access to, viewing information related to their group. You can start to get very specific with security and how you share this, especially if you have user filters enabled within your dashboard. So first, I'm actually going to transition to our Tableau server, which you all see right here. And typically when I am sharing information, I have levels of access and I create those groups on the server. So here, for demo purposes, I've created a diversity demo high access group and a diversity demo limited access group. And I'll talk about the permissions that I'm going to assign to both of these groups. Now, once you create the group, you simply select add group. You can then assign users to these groups. So within the high access group, I went ahead and assigned myself as well as a teammate of mine, Eric, to the group for the high access group. And then in terms of limited access, I went ahead and placed Mike within the limited access group. So Mike works within sales in our organization, and maybe I just did not want him to have all of the details for this dashboard. Now, when I transition back to Tableau, I'm going to select server, then I'm going to select publish workbook. And the first thing I want to do is select the project that I'm going to publish this to, right? You can create your own project. You can create a new project folder. You can't do that here within the publish screen. You have to do that directly on the server itself. But once you have that project created, you can either create the high level of the project or the nested project, which are drill downs within each of them. For demo purposes, I've already created a project called training demo, right? So you're going to name it. You can associate some tags with it. You can set up a refresh schedule. If you've connected live to any of these data sets, you can set up a refresh schedule to automatically refresh it. You can determine which sheets you want to publish. So typically when I'm creating dashboards and once I'm finished with them, I hide all of the sheets, but you can select which sheets you want to edit. You can say only publish dashboards and whatnot, but you can get very specific with what goes up to the server. Now, permissions, in this case, were done at the project level. So by default, whatever permission I assign to the training demo project folder on the server is what is going to be associated with this by default. However, I can edit those permissions simply by selecting edit and saying add permissions and add users. And here I'm going to select, which one is this? The high access group. And within the high access group is Eric and myself. Now you have information on security options in terms of what individuals within this group can do with this dashboard once it's published. So you can allow them to view it, which is simply viewing it. You can allow them to filter if you want them to, or you can deny them the filtering. You can allow them the ability to comment on it or view comments or add comments. So typically I allow commenting or viewing comments and adding comments. You can allow them or disable the ability to download this PDF. But what's really important here and what I want to talk about is download summary data and downloading full data, right? So each chart here that you see here, the summary data is the aggregated data. So it's going to say diverse 60%, not diverse, the remaining percentage, and that's typically going to be your summary data for each of these charts. Now, full data is going to be every single data point that makes up that chart. And you want to be very particular with permissions when you're publishing confidential information in terms of, employee diversity. So typically, if you do not have high access, we deny those permissions so that you do not have that ability to download the full data. We also deny web editing. We deny the ability to save a copy locally, because when you're publishing these dashboards up to the server, the workbook, the data is associated with this workbook, and anyone that can download this workbook can see that data. You don't want them to see that confidential information. So you can just deny all of these permissions. I'm going to give the high access group the ability to download a copy, because say for instance Eric works within HR as well, he's going to have the ability to download this and edit the views as needed. So we'll set the permission for the diversity demo high access, and now we can even add in another permission level just for this workbook for the lower access level. So Mike is in this group, and Mike, I only want Mike to have the ability to view and filter, right? So we're going to deny Mike everything. I guess we can let him take an image of it or a PDF of it as well and share that. But everything else we're denying for Mike, right? So now I can go ahead and publish this up to the server. And when I do that and I share this link, when Mike accesses this dashboard, Mike is not going to have the function or the ability to download and view the underlying data. So if I go ahead and select publish, just so you all can see what's associated with it and what I mean by downloading data, full data and summary data. Let's see, and there it is. So it's published to the server. Here's our view. Give it a second. All right, so here's our view, and here's that download button. So if I select this chart right here, right? So Tableau doesn't let you download any form of data without referencing the chart that you want to download the data for. So if I select this chart here and I select download, because I'm in the high access group and I'm signed into the server as myself, I see the ability to download data. I see all of these options. If Mike signed into this, he would not see this Tableau workbook option. He would see the image option, the PDF option, and the PowerPoint option, which is going to basically just take an image or a PDF and let him download that, but he is not going to see data, crosstab, or Tableau workbook. Now, when I select data, just remember the chart that I had selected, all of the aggregated data is in your summary snapshot. So here are the numbers for all of the data points associated with this. And when I look at the full data, you now see employee identification information. And this is why I said it's very important that you know the difference between summary and full data, and making sure that you assign permissions correctly for this. So here we can see which employees are considered diverse, which ones, who's not. So you want to make sure that you're assigning permissions correctly, validating them, testing them before you share out any of this information. I wouldn't be doing you all justice if I didn't, share that during a diversity webinar. So sharing and communicating your results, we talked through exactly how to publish it, assigning groups, assigning projects. Just make sure that you are very careful with that information, right? It can do, you're putting out good information, but it actually can do more harm than good to your organization if you aren't careful with the permissions around that data. And now let's talk about beyond the dashboard, right? So a lot of times organizations stay here. They identify areas of focus. They look at this dashboard and they say, all right, there were only 4% of people of color within the director organization. That might come up over the years, right? A lot of organizations don't just go beyond the numbers. So I am challenging you all to go beyond just your numbers and just identifying your areas of focus. Look at ways to start to develop an improvement process, right? So how can we improve the 4% that we saw for people of color for the director role, right? What do we need to do? That's going to take you diving into the data a little bit deeper to see who's in that role right now. Why is that number only at 4%? So once you have that, you can start to develop an improvement process around that. Once you develop that process, you want to make sure you're implementing it and assigning responsibility for it. And then, as I said before, what doesn't get measured doesn't get done. So you want to make sure that you are tracking progress against those areas that you identified early on to focus on. So has that number gone up? What are you targeting that 4% to be at within the next 6 months, within the next year, right? You want to make sure that you're tracking those numbers and having some type of accountability towards them. So this is just one starter workbook that I'm showing you all here. I do plan to roll out, or we do plan to roll out at Lovelytics additional workbooks that you all could start to use to maybe start to track some of that progress once you identify those areas. So be on the lookout for all of that information. And if you are looking to download this workbook for yourself, you can navigate to our Tableau Public portfolio. We're Lovelytics on Tableau Public, and that scorecard is available right here for download for anyone. So you can download this workbook, and once you download that workbook, you can edit the data source by selecting data source, and you can find that file on your local computer. So this is looking for that HR data file. You can go ahead and locate and find that file on your computer and switch it out and see, or excuse me, not on your computer, but within your server or wherever that data is housed. You can just find that data and place it into the dashboard and then see your numbers. So this is what we consider a starter workbook for you all. Then in terms of the recording will be available either today or tomorrow on designsecretsforanondesigner.com. So we hold these webinars on a recurring basis. This webinar, I really didn't go into the details around design because I feel like the topic of diversity is way more important than talking about how to design a scorecard to make it look good. I'm not worried about designing it. I'm more so concerned with making sure you understand your numbers and then worry about the design for it. However, Design Secrets for a Non-Designer is where we host our recordings and our videos. We also host them on YouTube as well. So this is my personal blog, and we also host it on the Lovelytics YouTube channel. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. So here is my information right here. And with that, thank you all for attending today. Mike, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you for any questions that we received.
Yes, thank you so much. So the first question we received, and it could be a hypothetical. So how do you, or would you, handle employees that do not respond to your diversity questions? Are they included in your 2,422 employees displayed? And does that bring down your average? Or is the the 21.9% persons of color only calculated as a percentage of respondents to your diversity collection or survey?
So typically when you come into an organization and you are self-identifying, there's options. So you can either say male, female, or you choose not to identify, right? So within the dashboard, that's why I said if you chose not to identify, then that's grouped up as non-diverse. So within the dashboard, non-diverse is white males or NA. So if you're looking at the gender breakout, it's female, and then everyone else is non-female. So that's why I didn't say just, it's males and NAs. And the same thing for people of color, because you cannot force employees to self-identify, but you can just let your users know, your end users know how you are grouping those employees who chose not to identify.
And then we have one other question on ranking the percent of total, and hopefully I articulate this correctly. So if we add a month, continuous month, and the data is in the highlight table, can we rank based on a particular month?
Yes. That's the short answer. You can do a lot. You can edit that compute using a lot. You probably would not be able to do it with a continuous month. You would have to make that discrete, and then you can compute using across that date.
And then I think this is our last question, but of course, right, anyone who has anything outside of today, why not exclude the unknown or any answers? Is this a best practice?
You typically don't want to exclude your employees. You want to make sure that you are counting every single employee, whether they choose to identify or not identify. You can misrepresent data if you exclude them from the overall, the overall scorecard.
Excellent. Well, I think that's it for us today. Of course, please feel free to email us. Chantilly's got her information up, and of course, we'll send out the recording. So if you have any burning questions, or if you'd like us to present this to your company or department in the future, by all means, please reach out. So with that, thanks everyone for joining today. The recording will be available later this afternoon or early tomorrow, as she said, and then we will continue this series and hope to have you again in the future. Thanks, everybody. Have a great one.